This is an autocracy invading a democracy. It's as simple as that. I know, well, why didn't you get worked up about Palestine or Yemen or Syria? Well, it was more complicated. There's a sort of civil wars. This is not a civil war, although the Russians try to sort of pretend it is. And the sheer bestiality of what the Russians have been doing is quite extraordinary. I agree. I mean, there are going to be lots of problems reconstructing Ukraine, although it had made enormous progress over the 30 years I've been going there. About 50% of the national economy was owned by a dozen people.
Henry Marsh is a renowned neurosurgeon and a pioneer of neurological advances in Ukraine. Since 1992, he's worked with surgeons across the country, sharing his skills and expertise to help modernise the system and improve patient care. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February, he wasted no time organising crash tutorials with Ukrainian doctors and nurses online to help cope with the influx of gravely wounded soldiers and civilians. Henry Marsh has been no stranger to death throughout his medical career, yet he was forced to face his own mortality after being diagnosed with prostate cancer during the coronavirus pandemic. He reflects on this bewildering transition from doctor to patient in his latest book, And Finally. Henry has just returned from Ukraine last week, and I'm delighted to say joins me now in the Times radio studio. Welcome back, Henry.
Thank you very much.
And maybe we could start with you just describing the situation that you found on your last visit to Ukraine.
Well, I'd gone out to Lviv to take part in a joint literary festival between Lviv and Hay-on-Wye with lots of very famous writers, partly online, partly actually out there. And that all was fine, quite peaceful. I'd been in Ukraine a few weeks ago, and it had been perfectly peaceful then in the west of the country. And I'd had a long-term plan to go out to my friend Rachel Clark, the palliative care doctor and writer, because palliative care in Ukraine is pretty lacking. And then we were going on to Kiev. I took the train to Kiev on Saturday night. And as we drew into the main station in Kiev, the missiles started falling. And of course, railway stations are often the first targets. I mean, the Russians killed, I think, 45 people in Kramatorsk a few weeks ago at the railway station. So it was exciting, very disappointing, because my people who'd taken me out there insisted we were evacuated next day because it would cost them a lot of life insurance if we'd been killed, which was unlikely. So I had to cut short my visit, but it was still a very constructive week.
I was interested in your description, when the air raid sirens started to wail, yourself and the people around you, in particular, I imagine the Ukrainians around you, remained remarkably calm. Is that an indication of the almost predictability with which they're facing danger now, or is it a stoical Ukrainian attitude?
I think it's the same if you look at what happened in Britain during the Second World War with the Blitz, or when the British and Americans are razing all the German cities to the ground. You just got to carry on. You can't freak out. What interested me purely personally, if you'd told me, when you arrive in Lviv, when you arrive in Kiev, you were going to be surrounded by missiles going off, I would have thought, well, I'll be terrified. And what absolutely fascinated me, I wasn't.
So what did you feel?
It was exciting. And I felt incredibly alive. And everything was very bright and clear. And of course, I went into neurosurgery because, in a sense, like many surgeons, I'm attracted to risk. And I think to a certain extent, the same applied to being bombed. It would have been very different if they'd been Russian soldiers coming to kill me. But my wife, Kate, who is an anthropologist, looked at me rather dubiously and said, you're not becoming a war junkie, are you? And I said, no. But it was completely not what I expected.
But it sounds like you understood there and then what those sort of war journalists and war photographers feel, yes. and end up craving when they try and walk away from it.
It's an addiction, can be an addiction.
Speaking of addictions, talk to me about this long-standing relationship you have with Ukraine, which you've called your second home, and Lviv your favourite European city. How did it start?
Well, it really goes back to the fact I originally read PPE at Oxford, not personal protective equipment, but politics, philosophy, as funnily enough did Rachel Clark. And we both separately, I was there 23 years before her, had a sort of change of heart, change of mind, and became doctors. But when I was at Oxford, my main interest was in Eastern European politics, and I studied under Archie Brown at St Antony's, who went on to become a very eminent criminologist. So I suppose if, I was expecting to become an academic criminologist, but for various reasons, I became a doctor. So I always had this deep interest in that part of the world, partly because my mother was a refugee from it became East Germany, Magdeburg, a political refugee, and it was kind of part of my cultural DNA. So when, purely by chance, in 1992, 1 year after independence, I was asked by an English trader to go and give some lectures in Kiev, which had a famous neurosurgical hospital, I went and I met a very energetic, extraordinary young neurosurgeon and spent many years going out there working with him, and he came to work with me in London. We fell out eventually, and I now work with some different people. But it's a remarkable country, and although I didn't realize I was being very prescient, but I understood right from the start that Ukraine was a very important country. The watershed between Western European liberalism and Asian Russian autocracy.
Do you think we've been very slow to wake up to that? Because I think one of the things that people have realised, and one of the surprises since this awful war broke out, is just how little we know about Ukraine and how, in a way, we haven't really considered it a European
Yes, I
nation.
think that's true. I'd come back years ago and say, I've just come back from Ukraine. And family, not my family, but friends were saying, where's that? Isn't it part of Russia? And I'd say, no, it's something different. And of course, the history of that part of the world is enormously complicated. Nobody has a clean pair of hands, endless ethnic cleansing. At least a quarter of the Ukrainian population died in the last century through famine, civil war, Second World War, and all that. It is an extraordinary country, and you meet extraordinary people. There's a wonderful quotation from the famous Hungarian poet Georgi Faludi, who said, Soviet communism destroyed people who were made of, it was like acid poured over metal. It destroyed people made of base metal, but the people made of gold shone all the brighter. And you meet some quite remarkable people. And you see that now with Ukraine. I mean, there are some really smart young people now, and as you see from extraordinary tweets and memes and jokes they're putting out on social media at the moment.
But as you say, nobody has a clean pair of hands in that region. Do you think we do them a disservice by so polarising what's going on at the moment? I mean, is it as simple as evil Russia, good Ukraine?
Yes, it is. Well, not necessarily good Ukraine, but this is an autocracy invading a democracy. It's as simple as that. I know, well, why didn't you get worked up about Palestine or Yemen or Syria? Well, it was more complicated. There's a sort of civil wars. This is not a civil war, although the Russians try to sort of pretend it is. And the sheer bestiality of what the Russians have been doing is quite extraordinary. I agree. I mean, there are going to be lots of problems reconstructing Ukraine, although it had made enormous progress over the 30 years I've been going there. About 50% of the national economy was owned by a dozen people. And it was deeply corrupt at all levels of society. So how you rebuild a country like that is very difficult. But the first thing to do is to win the war. Because if Putin succeeds in any way, that is like a green light for dictators all over the world to behave horribly. And given that we all face the catastrophe of climate change, warfare and murder is not the way to solve it.
Tell me a bit then about your work in Ukraine. 30 years, I think, you've been going backwards and forwards. What was the state of the sort of medical world in Ukraine when you first went there, and what did you need to want to achieve?
Well, it was absolutely awful, is the answer. I mean,
that's frank.
The cupboard was empty, and their neurosurgery was sort of 50 years out of date. So the first few years was mainly ferrying out second-hand medical operating microscopes, which they didn't have, things like that. And then teaching this one guy and trying to teach some of his colleagues how to do modern microscopic neurosurgery. And for quite a few years, we were doing things which nobody else could do in the country. But since then, there's much more. It's spread. And although Ukraine's a relatively poor country, so its healthcare remains pretty poor, it has sort of modern private hospitals which are equal of anything in the West.
How prepared then do you think they were for dealing with the casualties of this conflict?
Well, relatively well prepared, because they've been at war since 2014. So the Ukrainian army, people were dying every week on the front in Donetsk and Luhansk, but the Western media had kind of lost interest in that. So they were relatively well prepared. And of course now they are being massively supported by Western states.
But I think that you had to, as the war broke out, you had to carry out webinars to provide sort of crash courses
that was the
in
idea
trauma.
of David Knott, the great war surgeon, who's an amazing guy, he really is. But that really was his idea, and I just provided him with Ukrainian contacts and tagged along and did a bit on neurosurgery. But in fact, although 25% of battlefield injuries are head injuries, the scope for treating them on the battlefield is very small. All you do with war neurosurgery is repair minor wounds to the surface of the brain and to the skull.
Oh, just skull. That?
Yeah, that's all you can do. So there's no major brain. War surgery is all about blood loss, amputations, blast injuries, things like that. Neurosurgery is a very small part of it. So my role in that was very small. My role really on the most recent visit, and the previous one in July, is a sort of morale boosting for my Ukrainian friends. And also I just have a terrible need to go and see them and be with them.
How is their morale?
They'd have to get on with things. They can't afford to lose. That's, I think, what Putin and the Russians just didn't understand. For Ukraine, this is a fight to the death. It's as simple as that. It really is very... They know that if the Russians win, it is the end of everything for them.
Well, you mentioned a fight to the death, and I don't want to belittle one nor the other, but you've had your own fight, and luckily not to the death. Because...
Well, not yet. And I'm almost 73. It was curious, as I said in this article I had in the Times this morning.
Well, you had a diagnosis of prostate cancer.
Advanced prostate cancer with a sky-high PSA, which only about 4% of men achieve. I'm rather proud of that.
You get excited by finding yourself in an air raid. You're proud of your extremely serious diagnosis.
Neurosurgeons are a bit like that, I'm afraid. We are risk seekers. No, it's been very difficult. It's sort of living in the shadow of death. You can never quite forget it. I may be alive quite a few years, I may not. I simply don't know. But given I'm in my 70s, I'm reaching the end of my life anyway. We're all completely unrealistic about what old age is like for most of us. And yes, we all think Sensei's still incredibly alive and well and compos mentis in their late 80s, but most people aren't. And
yes, true. But is there a point? I mean, you say you're 73 years old. Do you feel like, oh yeah, I've done my living now? Did you think prostate? Oh, okay, that's fine. That's one way to go.
No, I didn't feel that. I felt very frightened about it. But I felt simultaneously to being very frightened when I got the diagnosis. I'd actually had a complete life, and I've been very lucky. And what matters in life is what we leave behind. And there are no pockets in the shroud. And as a doctor, of course, you're very lucky because just by doing your work, you're helping other people.
Were you shocked to find that you were medically fallible? Because I think part of the doctor's training is to think that you are impervious to the possibility of any kind of illness, because otherwise, knowing so much about it, you spend your whole life, you'd be the world's worst hypochondriac, wouldn't you?
It's not part of the training, but it's something that happens to almost all of us. You learn that disease is something that happens to patients, not to us. It is said, though I have no data on it, that doctors typically present with advanced cancer because they've been denying it or dismissing it. I certainly did. But my new book, and finally, is always about self-deception of all sorts. I deceive myself in many ways about Ukraine. I deceive myself about the pandemic. I haven't deceived myself about climate change. But I think a lot of other people are choosing to avert their eyes. And in some of the book, I talk about the fact we just don't understand the relationship between the conscious self and the unconscious self. We just haven't got the metaphors for it. Yet everything you and I are thinking at the moment is somehow arising out of our unconscious.
And how do you think, if you apply that to what the Ukrainian people, your friends in Ukraine, are feeling at the moment, this idea where suddenly, you take someone like me who, has happily not had too many brushes with near-death experiences, and suddenly I'm exposed to it on a daily basis. How does that impact, do you think, and how will it impact the sort of psyche of a nation?
Well, I mean, there'll be an awful lot of post-traumatic psychological problems, inevitably. Although for the soldiers, fighting, we know from research done by Simon Wesley that they know post-traumatic stress disorder is more likely in people who are badly led and also have pre-morbid personality problems. And I think one of the problems all the Vietnam vets was they got back home and they've been fighting in a meaningless war. The war the Ukrainian soldiers are fighting in is not meaningless. It's meaningless for the Russians. But there'll still be an awful lot of suffering. In Lviv, every day there were military funerals, and it was heartbreaking.
You said that your prognosis made you look back on the conversations that you've had with patients when you've been in a position to be giving them bad news or whatever, and made you think a little bit about your delivery. Tell me about that.
Well, one of the great problems in medicine, which I think many people just don't quite realise, is when it comes to talking to patients, particularly when they're serious conversations, as so often they are, you never get any feedback. Patients, and I because the nature of neurosurgery being what it is, I had many difficult conversations about death and brain damage, more often with the families rather than with the patient, because the patient often was unconscious. But they wouldn't ring me up next day and say, Mr. Marsh, you explained that very well, or Mr. Marsh, you're awful. So it's very hard to learn how to do it, very hard. And yet, and although obviously there's only one rule in medicine, which is to treat people as you'd wish to be treated yourself, you have to be kind of detached and compassionate at the same time. And finding that balance is really very difficult. And before I knew whether I had really more or less terminal disease or not, and I don't because I haven't got metastatic spread yet to the skeleton or soft tissues, I was in a very sort of anxious, hyped up state. And it was very strange. I suddenly started remembering so many patients I'd completely forgotten from 20 or 30 years ago. They also surrounded me, rather like reproachful ghost patients where either not necessarily my fault, but basically I'd failed for one reason or another to help them. And you see an awful lot of suffering in neurosurgery. I thought probably the explanation of this weird, massive flashback was somehow I was hoping if all these people forgave me, I would survive and I'd be all right.
The pearly gates would be yours.
Bit of sort of sympathetic magic. But it's really difficult to learn how to talk to patients. And you can get too involved. You can get, some of my decision making I think was bad because I'd been looking after patients too long and found it very hard to say it's time to stop. And over-treatment is a huge problem in modern medicine now. And it's one of the big problems of private practice, that the patient is no longer an end. The end is the patient becomes a means to the end. And all sorts of distorting factors start influencing clinical decisions. And most clinical decisions are not binary, they're not either or. They're not black, they're end of shades of grey. They're all about estimating probabilities. And your estimation of probabilities is going to get distorted, even unconsciously, by financial gain.
What do you mean the patient becomes a means to an end?
In private medicine, the purpose of medicine is to make a profit. Simple as that. If not for the doctor, if for the hospitals. And
but not to prolong an illness in order to make a profit, surely.
But it's going to distort your judgment about the probabilities. What are the risks of treatment? What are the risks of not treatment? These are probabilities. And as we know from Kahneman's work, our estimation of probabilities is often a very inconsistent process.
So what about the way the NHS works, which obviously you've been exposed to now as a patient as well as a practitioner? We hear all the time that it's in crisis, that it's not fit for purpose. Yeah. Obviously, there are huge queues of patients and so on. How bad do you think it is, and what needs to change?
There's a short-term problem and a long-term problem. Short-term problem is it's been starved of funds for 12 years. And the population has been getting older and older, and there's more and more. There are 100,000 staff vacancies. I mean, that's fantastic. About 10,000, I don't know, thousands of nurses. An awful lot of older doctors and nurses are leaving. So there's a real problem. There's a long-term problem which affects all healthcare systems, which is populations of wealthy countries are getting older, and medical treatment is getting more and more powerful and more expensive. And you have to make very difficult choices between, do we spend £500,000 on this CAR-T cell treatment to save the life of one person with relapsed leukemia, or do we spend it on 100,000 incontinence devices for ill people? I mean, it's an exactly extreme example. And in fact, this country has led the way in that with the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, NICE, or that's now changed its name, which I worked for 5 years, where you try to make rational choices between this. But that's a long-term problem. At the moment, there's a really serious short-term problem, except that it takes years to train doctors and nurses. So there'll be no easy solution to this huge staff shortage.
Do you think we've become complacent about the wonderful thing that the NHS is? I mean, in a way, the only way to resolve the situation is for all of us to invest in it more because we believe in it.
Well,
no?
it needs more money, and it's a tax-funded system. So it's a question of politicians looking the public in the eye and saying you need to pay more tax. The argument is not fit for purpose and is inherently flawed, is absolute rubbish. There are basically tax-funded systems in the Scandinavian countries. Sure, everything is better in Scandinavia, but there's no inherent problem with the tax-funded system, as some people are arguing. And the people arguing it are all for the private sector, private hospitals, and it's all about making profit.
You said, politicians, need to take long-term views, and I wonder, having just come back from Ukraine, which would obviously, shape your consciousness in one way, what it feels like to be returning to the turmoil of the political sort of circus going on at the moment, which feels a lot more like sort of Italian politics in the 80s than anything else.
I'm ashamed and embarrassed. I think this country is a very great country in many ways. I'm proud of the fact it's so multiracial and pluralistic, and seeing it becoming the sort of laughing stock of the international community because of the fact the Tory party could not accept we were no longer an empire and great and all that business is horrible.
Just finally, today we've seen another wave of attacks on Ukraine's capital with these Russian kamikaze drones, or in fact Iranian kamikaze drones, I think, ultimately.
Thank you, Iran.
Yes, thanks. Targeting residential buildings. In your opinion, what needs to be done to support the Ukrainian people, and how important is it that we do?
It's the support in the short term has to be guns, and more guns. No, I don't like. I'm not a militarist. In the longer term, the country will need reconstructing. I don't think it'd be easier to have a Marshall Plan for Ukraine in the way you did. Germany had been totally razed to the ground, and Germany had a long tradition, not of democracy, but of a very disciplined, hard-working country. Ukrainians work very hard, but they're quite a rough lot in some ways. So I see lots of problems there, but in the short term, the Russians have to be stopped. And I hope I'm right, as in many other observers. I think the threat of nuclear war is small, but not negligible.
You said you felt, as you returned home, safe but sad. Does that pretty much sum it up?
Very much so. I've got very, very close friends there I've known for 20 or 30 years. And it's very painful to say goodbye to them. It's awful.
Henry Marsh, thank you very much indeed.
It's a pleasure.